to the 2013 Spring Communication Conference. And our theme this morning is He Said, She Said, Improving Gender Communication in the Workplace and at Home. And my name is Elizabeth Kissling.
And I'm Amy Farrell, and we're both co-advisors for Speak Out, which is the Communication Studies Club here at SCC. We're also both communication professors here. We want to let you know that this conference is a student-led conference. It's sponsored by Speak Out and the Business and Professional Communication class. So let's give them a round of applause.
Every sign, every cookie, everything, this is theirs. So we're really, really proud of them. We'd like to call your attention to the conference brochure. If you take a look at that, please, you should all have one. If you're missing one of the people from the class would glad to give you an extra. Take that out, please, if you would. All these are here. It will show you the offerings from 8:30 this morning until 11:30. We have a keynote address in here, and at 9:30 there's another workshop in here, and one in Sasquatch Bigfoot and another in Littlefoot A and B. And at 10:30 we have a student panel in here, and again, other additional workshops for you to go to. Those will be fantastic. We also want to draw your attention to, there are lots of communication studies brochures around. There are flyers that show the classes that our wonderful department offers this summer and also next fall. We'd love you to come and take some of our classes. You may pick those up right out on the table as you leave here this morning. And we also, for anyone who's faculty or staff, if you're getting credit, the sign-in is in Bigfoot Sasquatch on the table in there. So finally, we are thrilled this morning for you to have a chance to listen and to learn and put on your critical thinking caps as you get a walk down and a look at gender communication. And now we're going to turn this over to Andy Duncan, who is the president of Speak Out, and we are delighted to have him here. So thank you so much for being here. We'll introduce our team this week.
Thanks, Linda and Amy. Welcome, everyone. Glad everybody made it this morning. A little over 3 years ago, I started here, and my first class was Communication 101. And over the quarters, I experienced interpersonal, cultural, conflict management, and then probably my highest life changers, gender communication. Through that, I found out stuff about me, others, the differences why women and men have those troubles of communicating. So we decided to really make this conference the most that we can, find a wide array of speakers, and do what we can to really expand this information of gender communication. Dr. Elizabeth Kissling is an Eastern Washington University professor for 20 years now. She has studied women's studies within communications, and we're really excited to have her here. So I'm not going to waste any more time, and we're going to get Dr. Kissling up here. So please give us all a round of applause for Elizabeth Kissling.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Very honored, and I thank Andy and all the members of Speak Out for inviting me. I want to start out. We collaborated on the title here. Women are from Earth, men are from Earth. Probably not too surprising, but the title is a response to the mythology that you may be familiar with. The idea that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I suspect many of you are familiar with this idea. It's based on the belief that women and men communicate differently and use different rules, different language, and it's so different that women and men are from different planets. Essentially, it's the idea of women talk more, women are more skillful communicators, men talk to get things done, women express their feelings, men are competitive, women are cooperative, and Guild. I've illustrated this with a cartoon that was in the news recently, a local paper from Zits that illustrates this with teenagers. The woman talking so much that the young man who just wishes to throw a delete button. See this? We see this as well illustrated in our popular culture. I don't want to spend too much time reiterating this because I think you're all pretty familiar with it, but I did bring in one video that we see this a lot in our popular culture, in television and movies and such. You may remember the hit TV show many years, Everybody Loves Raymond.
I did nothing. I did. When did you say, excuse me, I just need some space right now in my office? When I sighed. You sighed? Yeah, I went. I'm supposed to know what that means? Yes, because when you went, I gave you the bathroom. I never went. Oh, come on, you practically fogged up the mirror with you. In fact, you didn't get the message even though I had to go, Okay, fine. If I just... I'm a little busy. If I did sign, I didn't mean anything by it. Oh, no. I know you too well. I know exactly what it meant. It made you smell, get out. Ray, you may smell, but you offered to leave. Well, I didn't mean it. Well, why did you say it? I was being nice. Well, this should be a little lesson for you. You should always mean what you say. And you should always mean what you sigh.
You've all seen this before, haven't you? We don't really need to rehearse all these examples. You're familiar with the idea that men and women are so different, we're always miscommunicating, misinterpreting each other's intentions, and particularly in heterosexual relationships. I don't really have a lot of time to talk about the underlying assumption that everyone's heterosexual. We can maybe talk about that in the questions and answers. But neither men nor women come across looking very well in this. It's particularly patronizing to men. They're portrayed either as bullies, pushing women around, or petulant toddlers, or barely capable of communication at all. Men often come across looking about as communicative as lassie. And women are like, "Oh, is there something, boy? What? Is doing well?" Really, the only reason I think that men kind of think with this is it kind of lets them off the hook. Women have to do all the translation work. So I really want us to take a closer look at this Venus-Mars mythology, because it is, as you know, very, very popular. Why do these stereotypes sell? And they do sell. This is just a little sample of how popular this stuff is. John Gray, who authored the book Men of Mars, Women of Venus, has an entire industry based on this. I'm not going to read all of this, but it's a lot of books, and a board game that is real. I did not make this up. The book was first published more than 20 years ago, and there are more than 50 million copies sold. There's a movie in development right now, and Reese Witherspoon has been signed to star in it. I'm not making that up. Why are these so popular? There's several reasons. One of the reasons is that sex and gender are primary categories in most cultures. There's lots of ways we could organize society. We could divide people on the basis of eye color or height or hair color. But sex and gender are primary ways of organizing people into categories. And humans organize people into categories. It's just one of the things we do. So that's one of the reasons. And another reason is assumptions of difference are linked to our concepts of heterosexual romance. And our concepts of heterosexuality and romance are built on this idea of opposite sexes. I put that in scare quotes because I don't really like that idea that men and women are opposites, as if we're mutually exclusive categories. As you'll hear in a few minutes, there's a lot of reasons to think we're more similar than we are different. But when we talk about difference, we tend to make them sexy. We sexualize those differences. And in our capitalistic society, differences are profitable. We sexualize difference and we make money on difference. And John Gray is raking it in, as I've already indicated. And this emphasis on difference is political. It sexism and classism and a whole lot of other isms if we let it. So let's take a quick look at what some of the research about gender and communication tells us. Scholars in communication and in gender studies have been looking at these issues for more than 4 decades, and they tell us a very different story. A little more complicated than Venus and Mars mythology, and a lot more interesting. And obviously I don't have time to rehearse 40 years of research, but I want to pull out just a few of the more recent studies, particularly in the last 10 years or so. Take a look at what you can see. Particularly some of the limitations and some of the corrections in the last 10 years or so. One of the things that we've seen in research is that early research on communication and gender tended to emphasize group differences. That is, we would look at gender and emphasize the difference. We would always be looking for that difference, that profitable, sexy difference, instead of looking for the similarities. So research that found similarities between women and men often didn't get published. Sometimes that's called the file door problem. We have no idea how many studies searching for gender difference found similarities and couldn't get published, so they're sitting in some researcher's file cabinet. There's also a lot of studies that don't match. We have a lot of research that's basically equivocal. I've illustrated here with this little gender conflict as an example, because our conflict research really doesn't answer a question. We have mixed results. Some research shows men are more assertive and aggressive. Some studies show women to be more assertive and aggressive. Some studies of gender conflict suggest that there's actually a third variable, that we can't really say either sex is more aggressive or more assertive. We also have a lot of quantitative research that's very rigorous in terms of statistical analysis. We know that statistical studies, that is, are very reliable in their statistical analysis, but the magnitude of the effects is not that great. We know the statistics are very rigorous and reliable, but how great is the difference? We also should take a closer look at how gender is measured. A lot of our early studies actually measured sex and then talked about gender. In other words, we classified people as either male or female, but then we didn't look at whether they necessarily identified as masculine or feminine people. And a lot of you that are studying gender communication probably know that having male or female parts doesn't necessarily mean that your identity as a person is as a man or a woman. It could be anywhere along a long, diverse continuum of masculinity or femininity. So let's take a couple look at just a couple of studies. One of the centerpieces of this the myth, Mars-Venus mythology is comforting behavior, what Gail Jefferson many years ago called troubles talk. Supposedly, according to the Venus mythology, the Venusians, women, are better at comforting behavior. They listen more to troubles talk. They talk to one another more about their troubles. But a study by Irina McGeorge and her colleagues at Purdue in 2004 found that actually McGeorge and her team ran 3 studies, and they found that both women and men are both good at providing troubles talk, that is, at being sympathetic to a communication partner, in giving sympathetic talk about, oh, I know what you mean, that happened to me too. They also were very good, equally good at responding to troubles talk, and they both were believed that providing supportive communication skills is an important part of a friendship, of a family relationship, and a romantic partnership. And they both made similar judgments of what counts as sensitive, helpful, supportive communication. Another study, and this one is much broader, this is Janet Hyde's study, the Gender Similarities Hypothesis, and you can kind of tell from the title what her results were. She argues that men and boys and women and girls are similar on most, but not all, psychological variables. We're more similar than different. And she used a statistical technique called meta-analysis. What this does is let her combine the results of several different studies. And what Hyde did is she took 46 other studies that were meta-analyses and pooled those. So she did kind of a meta-analysis. And she looked at aggression, leadership, self-esteem, reading skills, math, communication skills. And I have here a chart that shows the communication skills that she had meta-analyses of. And what she looked at in particular is these studies all found differences and they showed statistical variation. So we have that example I was saying about this, there's a statistical difference, but it's not a very big difference. It's not a statistically significant difference. So even though we see a difference, for example, in assertive speech between women and men, it's so small that it doesn't matter. It's a difference that doesn't really make a difference. And she found in all of these studies that there were very few exceptions. There were a few motor skills, such as men can generally throw a ball further and faster than women, and a few aspects of sexuality. But for the most part, men and women are far more similar than they are different on everything that psychologists have ever measured. And Hyde says that this exaggerated difference, gender difference, is not only inconsistent with scientific data, but it's harmful to relationships between women and men and to women's professional opportunities. Now, it's well known in studies of communication between women, in mixed groups between women and men, when women and men work together, men generally talk more. You know, the stereotype, people from Venus talk more than people from Mars, but when they're together, those Martians talk more in mixed-sex groups and workplace settings. And this happens even in professional settings, when women and men have pretty much equal standing and have the same formal rights in the situation. When the rule for the setting is majority rule, the men tend to dominate the conversation. Now, in this study by Karpowitz, Mendelberg, and Schenker, they found that if you change the rules, if you use the rule of consensus instead of majority rule, you can actually have a more egalitarian conversation, and the women are more likely to participate and have a chance to say their fair share. Very recent study, this was just published earlier this year by Carruthers and Reese in the Journal of Personality and in Social Psychology. Carruthers and Reese did meta-analysis as well, and they looked at 13 studies of gender difference in communication behaviors, and these 13 studies encompassed more than 13,000 individuals. And they looked at all the differences identified, and what they wanted to see is were the differences of degree or kind. So what they were interested in trying to see is were the differences categorizing women and men into two groups, or were they just differences of degree? And what they found is that it was an example of we see differences, so let's try to categorize the differences as putting women and men into big groups. And instead they found across all these differences 122 distinctions that were identified in all of these meta-analyses that they looked at. The differences tended to fall along a continuum. In other words, they didn't find any good evidence for examples of behavior that justified classifying women and men into two discrete categories. They were really overlapping groups. The differences tended to fall along a continuum. And I thought this was a nice illustration. I don't know if you can read the print. This is the comic strip Baby Blues about a young family with 3 kids. The husband's away on a business trip and the wife thinks to herself, it's a little more work for me with Dale gone. But it's also kind of nice being alone. But I would never tell him that. And then in the final frame there, you see her reading in bed thinking, oh, it would just break his heart. And he's in his hotel room reading by himself, thinking the same thing, saying, oh, it would break her heart. So we see men and women having similar thoughts about their lives, but afraid to tell one another. We're really more similar than different. So what does all of this mean? We have all this mythology and expectations that women and men are different. What can we actually do? So I want to emphasize a few suggestions. First of all, following the Karpowitz and colleagues studies, when we have a group situation where women and men are working together and they're tasked with solving a problem, coming up with a solution, when women are outnumbered by men, we need to work on using a rule of coming up with a unanimous decision. Use the consensus rule. When women are the majority, we can use the majority rule. That was the key difference in that political deliberation study. In job interviews, things are a little bit different. This comes at they found out that women did not flaunt their achievements. And this comes back to some of our social expectations that women are often taught not to brag. So if they didn't tell about what they'd done, the interviewers judged them as not accomplished. So now Google has into the protocol, interviewers are asked to, the interviewers are instructed to report the candidate's answers in more detail. The interviewers are instructed to ask the candidates about their accomplishments. And they also found that the interviewers who turned down, the women candidates who turned down job offers had often interviewed only with men. So now when they bring female candidates to the Google campus, they make sure that the women candidates get to meet other women that were already working at Google. And this can apply more broadly to any kind of diversity in a workplace. We tend to want to work with people, be around people who are similar to us, so we want to make sure there are people like us in the workplace. If you're a woman candidate coming into a workplace that's mostly male-dominated, you might think, oh man, I do not want to be the first woman here, the only woman on the job. So Google is now making sure that a woman who interviews gets to meet some of the other women. If you're a member of another minority group and you're being brought in, the company needs to make sure that they see the other people of color, the other gay folks, or whatever identity category that might be a minority in the workplace, so that you don't have the burden of representing everybody of your class or your category in the hiring process. So Google has actually made some changes based on some of these differences of identity in the workplace. In general, what this has to do with is focusing on receiver-oriented communication. And this is something I'm sure a lot of the communication majors in the room could tell us about. When we're interacting with someone, we tend to listen, waiting for our chances to speak. But what this is to improve gender communication, what we really need to think about is not what we're saying, but what the other person is saying, being more focused on the receiver. And this means thinking about gender communication as human communication, communicating with people as individuals, not as stereotypes. And so this means focusing on somebody for who they are, trying to break away from the stereotype, trying not to assume, oh, well, you're a lady, so that means you're going to be interested in this. You're a dude, so you want to talk about this. Try to focus on the person and who they are. It's more important, in other words, to adapt your conversational style to fit the context than to try to adapt to a gender stereotype or an expectation that somebody wants to talk about a certain thing or talk in a certain way because of their gender or sex identity. And I would like to try to talk with you about any questions you have. I know I talked kind of fast because I was worried I wouldn't have enough time, but I see I have plenty of time to answer some questions and talk about what is on your minds. So how am I doing this? See?
We're teaching in our gender communication class this quarter. We're talking about the media and television commercials and the screen time that people spend and the way women are portrayed in the media and the way men are portrayed in the media. Can you speak a little bit to how you see that and how that keeps those stereotypes alive and well in this culture?
Oh, yeah,
that's one of my favorite topics. I'm going to talk more about women in the media in the next session. Because that is definitely one of the ways these stereotypes are reinforced. And that's, and most of the representations that we see in television aren't very favorable. The example, I could have gone on and on with those examples of Raymond and King of Queens, and they're not very flattering to both, to either men or women. We see occasionally these little moments that kind of undermine that, but not very many. And I think it's really complicated because I don't think any of us watch that and go, yeah, I want to be just like Raymond. So, they do reflect and reinforce, and we kind of get this normal because our society is so saturated with media. Recent studies show that people in urban areas see something like 5,000 advertisements a day. That's staggering, isn't it? So when you think about it, it's not just television commercials. It's also radio ads, it's internet pop-up ads, it's the little flybys on our phone, and that's urban areas. So if that's stuff like New York, Chicago, LA, you gotta think that in Spokane we probably see 3,000 maybe. And we don't think about it. We think, oh, ads don't affect me, I just ignore them. But they're part of our environment. We don't ignore ads any more than fish ignore water. It's the environment that we swim in. So even though we might not consciously be looking at them and thinking, yeah, that's what I want to be like, they normalize what masculinity and femininity look like. But when we actually engage in person-to-person discussions about what our lives are like, we find that, we don't really live lives the way sitcom families do. When in my gender communication classes, we start talking about these things, and students say things like, well, my dad was always the one who cooked meals in our family. My mom could barely make toast. And then we start talking about it, and I said, well, why do we have these ideas then? Why do we say things like this? And then it comes down to because we have these images that tell us that's what normal is. Yeah.
I have a 13-year-old daughter, and social media is a huge issue in our home right now.
Oh, I can only imagine. I don't have any children.
It's a real issue. And what I am posting with her talking on what she does experience with her communication in those aspects is that there's a disruption in the ability of these kids to communicate with each other and be informed. And I think it's a pandemic that's the ability to actually communicate outside. That's a norm for them now, more so than the good old fashioned face to face. Is there research to be done on that and how to?
There's a lot of research ongoing about that. I don't know what the answer is yet. But it's certainly an issue. A lot of people are concerned in a lot of ways. And I'm a fan of social media. I use lots of different networks. I have a smartphone too. I'm online a lot. But yeah.
I find it very difficult to actually deal with this sister in trying to direct her and guide her in certain aspects. When she's asking for advice because of the way that her communication is versus mom. You have both mom communication.
Yeah. And there was a cord attached to the wall. In private conversations, we had to hope the cord was long enough you could take it around. Yeah, I'm 100 years old. That's what I tell my students every day. I'm 100. Yeah, it's emerging and ongoing, and it's part of our lives, and it's going to be, and we have to figure out how to adapt. And I don't know. I have friends who have kids that are like 4 and 5, and they have things like screen time rules. My friend whose little boy's going to be 5 next month is allowed a certain amount of screen time, and that includes computer, television, iPad, all together. I'm not sure exactly how much he's allowed right now, and I don't know how that's going to be evolving. But he's grown up with this. It really amuses me. She posts pictures of him since he was born. She's been posting pictures on Flickr. And she took pictures of his month's birthday every month, right? As well as first sort of daily pictures, and that's slowed down. But I thought, what's it like to grow up? Pictures daily, all the time. Like, he thinks he's Michael Jackson. Flashbulbs constantly. And I wonder what that's like, because when I was growing up, there were pictures on special occasions, and you had to wait 3 weeks for the film to be developed. So it is changing, and it's changing so fast that I don't have good ideas or suggestions, and maybe some of the other people that are parenting and struggling with it. And my friend that I'm talking about actually is an IT policy analyst. That's what she does for a living, is write technology policy. Yeah, and that's been fascinating to watch too, is that there are gender issues that are at play. In some ways, I think they're very old issues, and they're just magnified because of the technical and social media. Some of the bullying, for instance, that is, I think a lot of the bullying we're seeing is not new. It's just now it's documented in a way that it wasn't. There was always bullying in adolescence, at least well in the 20th century, at least since we've had junior high. And I think a lot of the bullying is about the same kinds of issues. A lot of the bullying we are seeing is about gender issues. It's about gender conformity. It's about sexuality. And it's about weight. And we're seeing these same issues, but we're now also seeing them not just in person and on the playground, but we're seeing them documented online. And so now we're seeing much more concern from adults about them. And we're seeing ramifications that we didn't see as well, because now everybody knows what happens. Now when a kid, hurts him or herself, everybody knows because the consequences are documented as well. So we may start to see some solutions because we're seeing the consequences very visibly and nationally. So there could be some long-term positive effects of this social media. Oh, lots of questions. I'm standing right away. I'm sorry, I don't even know who's first. In terms of meetings? Well, I'm not sure in terms of media. In terms of policy, a lot of large corporations are actually doing really well, and they're actually very supportive of marriage equality. Some of the big corporations have actually been donors. Companies like Microsoft and Apple have given a lot of resources to support marriage equality. For instance, in terms of like some of the issues about, you mean like communication in meetings? Well, that's a trickier question because, some of the communication style differences that aren't really marked the way traditionally we looked at sex differences, and we don't see really sexuality differences. What happens is sort of basically kind of the bullying issue again. People who are out and talk about their relationships. Adults can be bullied as well, and if a workplace has homophobic attitudes, they can be bullied or harassed or discriminated against for that. And I don't want to make a blanket statement that all big corporations are gay friendly, because they're not. There are also some that are very hostile. I have, in fact, a colleague, friend and colleague who, even though Washington now has marriage equality, these two women the partner can't be covered on her wife's insurance plan because the company is owned by an out-of-state company. So it's governed by federal laws. So even though, right, which has some family values policy that won't cover same-sex marriage. So it's not all big corporations, but many of the well-known popular companies like Microsoft, Apple, there's a couple of others I'm drawing a blank on. Over here.
How is the new media and internet is going about affecting, topics like international level? Countries where women are often growing and welfare and some of that. Is it affecting?
Oh, that's a pretty complicated question. And the international front's a little outside my expertise, but there's been a lot of attention to online harassment. Women who are identified as women online do receive a lot of harassment, a lot of threats, even death threats and rape threats. A couple of really dramatic examples of this have been in the news recently. One was Anita Sarkeesian's Kickstarter campaign. She was trying to raise money to do analysis of gender tropes in video games, and her personal sites were hacked. Some hackers made a video game. It was called something like Smack the Bitch, where they took an image of her, and every time you hit her, you could see bruises added to her face. She received death threats, rape threats. There were pornographic images of her posted on Wikipedia and on her sites. There was also the computer analyst who complained complained about some inappropriate remarks at a computer conference and posted it on Twitter and was harassed and fired. As were the people she complained about were also fired. So there's a lot of harassment of women in the technology industry and in the online world, just for speaking up and being obviously female. In terms of the international issues, you know, it's like which country, which part of which country, which social class. It's really a complicated question, and women have different access to online realms in different places. It's really complicated. Behind you? By some political scientists. They were particularly focusing on in groups like city councils and groups doing policy deliberation. And they found that when the rule for how you get things done is majority rule, and the group was mostly men, the women tended to have their ideas kind of shouted down. And I don't mean like violently shouted down, it's just the women's ideas were kind of dismissed or right, the women didn't feel like they had as many opportunities to talk. It was kind of like, oh, that's a good idea, Ms. Jones. We'll wait till a man thinks of it. Kind of. That's Dale Spender's term for it. And they didn't have as many opportunities to talk, and they just were more likely to be silenced in a group situation. But if the group was told, well, you have to achieve consensus, you can't just say, well, most of us agree, you know, there are two outliers, but the group has to achieve consensus, then the women had equal opportunity to talk, and their views were listened to, because the group had to agree. So even if everybody wasn't on the same page, they had to at least come up with a compromise that the whole group could work with. So you might say a group of 8 people, 5 men and 3 women, and the group had to, and they didn't necessarily agree along their votes weren't along gender lines, but the rule for discussion was majority rules. The women in the room didn't necessarily get their opinions as heard, didn't have as easy a time getting their say. Having a seat at the table didn't necessarily mean they had a voice in the conversation. But if the group was told, no, the group has to have consensus on the issue. So they might not have either of the 2 positions they started with, but they're more likely to come up with a policy everybody can live with. And partly because of those norms of social expectations of how we're supposed to communicate. If the women are the majority in the group, if that 5-3 was actually 5 women and 3 men, then you can use the majority rule. Except that women, you know, we were talking earlier when Professor Salisbury raised the issue of our expectations of gender. Women have been socialized to be respectful of other opinions and to listen. And in general, of course, there's lots of assertive, aggressive women who wouldn't, but in general, women have been trained to listen to everybody's view before they go and say, let's do it that. So they're more likely to listen and be persuaded by other opinions. So the majority rule is more likely to work in a group that's majority women. Yeah, it's because we're talking about, you know, at the same time, you know, I'm saying men and women are more similar than alike. We also live in a culture where men and women get taught different rules. And those things interact in strange ways sometimes.
You were talking earlier about changes for media or technology. Is this also because of how times are changing? We don't have any do this work cheaper households anymore?
Yeah, we never really did, to be honest. But yeah, there's a lot of social changes as well, and a lot of economic changes. You know, you're building my soapbox, but you know, the economy has changed not just with the recession in 2007. Real wages have been on the decline for 40 years. So, you know, a lot of economic changes, a lot of social changes, and political changes, and all of those have occurred at the same time, and they intersect in interesting and strange ways. Absolutely. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Will somebody shut me up? Oh, okay.